My father's text arrived while I was walking toward the West Wing. Don't come to your sister's engagement party. The guest list is already full. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk staring at the screen while people in dark suits walked around me like I wasn't even there. For a second, I forgot where I was. Then someone behind me said, "Morning, Emily?" I looked up automatically. "Morning." I slipped my phone back into my blazer pocket and kept walking. The White House has a strange way of forcing you to compartmentalize your life. You can be carrying the weight of your entire childhood on your shoulders, but once you step through those doors, someone is waiting for your briefing on a developing situation halfway around the world. Feelings can wait. National security can't. That morning had started like every other Tuesday. I left my Georgetown apartment just after 6. Picked up black coffee from the same little cafe on Wisconsin Avenue where the owner already knew my order. Drove across the Key Bridge while NPR quietly filled the car with stories about Congress arguing over another spending bill. Nothing unusual. Nothing dramatic. By 8 o'clock, I was inside the Eisenhower Executive Office building, reviewing intelligence summaries before heading to the West Wing. I'd done that routine for years. It felt almost comforting. People often imagine government work as glamorous. It isn't. Most days it's reading reports, checking facts, crossing out assumptions, asking questions nobody else thought to ask. My office overlooked part of the South Lawn, but I rarely noticed the view anymore. It was simply where I worked. I'd spent 23 years building a career inside Washington. I never planned on becoming important. I only wanted to do work that mattered. Apparently that made me the family disappointment. Back home in Dayton, Ohio, my parents told people I had a government office job. Sometimes they said I handled paperwork. Other times they hinted that I answered phones for a contractor. The story changed depending on who was asking. The truth never seemed convenient. Meanwhile, my younger sister Rachel had become the daughter everyone admired. She married a successful real estate developer. She had 2 beautiful little boys. She posted cheerful family photos on Facebook every weekend. She volunteered at church. People in Dayton loved her. And honestly, I loved her too. None of this had ever been Rachel's fault. She simply grew into the role our parents had already written for her. I was the difficult one, the selfish one, the daughter who left. 23 years earlier, I'd accepted a graduate scholarship in Washington instead of staying in Ohio. Dad told me I was abandoning my family. Mom cried for 3 straight days. Neither of them came to graduation. Neither called when I accepted my first federal job. Eventually, you stop expecting people to celebrate your victories. You just keep moving. That's why the text surprised me less than it probably should have. It wasn't the first family event I'd been excluded from. It just hurt in a familiar way. The conference room slowly filled with senior staff. Someone asked me a question about tomorrow's briefing. I answered. Another person requested updated figures. I provided them. For 90 minutes, nobody would have guessed I'd just been told not to attend my own sister's engagement party. Years of practice had made me very good at looking unaffected. Around 5 that afternoon, I finally had a moment alone. I unlocked my phone. Read Dad's message again. Still no explanation. No, sorry. No, maybe next time. Just a closed door. I typed 3 different replies. Okay. Deleted. Did I do something wrong? Deleted. Finally, I put the phone away without sending anything. Silence had become my native language with my parents. That evening, I drove home through heavy traffic. The apartment greeted me the same way it always did. Quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into the furniture after years of living alone. I kicked off my heels, changed into sweatpants, microwaved a bowl of macaroni and cheese because I was too tired to cook. The television played quietly in the background without really holding my attention. Sometimes loneliness isn't loud. Sometimes it's just eating dinner at your kitchen counter because setting the table feels unnecessary. Around 10:30, my phone rang. Rachel. For a moment, I smiled. Maybe she'd convinced Dad to change his mind. Maybe she'd called to apologize. I answered immediately. Hey, Rachel. I barely recognized her voice. She sounded breathless, angry, almost panicked. How could you do this to Mom and Dad? I frowned. What? You heard me. I honestly have no idea what you're talking about. There was a long silence. Then she laughed. Not because anything was funny, because she couldn't believe I was pretending. Oh, don't do that. Rachel, I'm serious. What happened? Dad saw the magazine. What magazine? You really expect me to believe you don't know? I don't know what you're talking about. Another silence. I could hear people talking somewhere behind her. Music. Glasses clinking. The engagement party was already underway. She lowered her voice. Everyone's talking about our family. I don't understand. You humiliated Mom and Dad. Before I could ask another question, the call ended. I stared at my phone. My heart had started beating faster, though I didn't know why. Magazine. What magazine? I walked to my laptop on the dining table and opened it. My email showed nothing unusual. I searched my name. Nothing. Then I searched Washington magazines. The Atlantic. Politics. Government profiles. The newest issue appeared. The cover loaded slowly. When it finally came into focus, I stopped breathing. It wasn't a studio portrait. It was a candid photograph taken during an international summit 6 months earlier. I was walking several steps behind the president, holding a classified briefing folder against my side. I remembered that day. I never realized photographers had captured that moment. Across the top of the cover were words I had never expected to read. The women America never sees. The quiet minds behind the nation's hardest decisions. I whispered to the empty apartment. I never talked to anyone. My finger hovered over the article. Then I clicked. Something told me my life had just changed. And somehow, my family's was about to change with it. I sat there for almost a full minute before I clicked the article. Outside my apartment window, Georgetown was settling into another ordinary Tuesday night. A city bus hissed to a stop on Wisconsin Avenue. Someone laughed as they walked past the building. A siren echoed somewhere in the distance. Everything outside felt perfectly normal. Inside my apartment, nothing did. I took a slow sip of coffee that had already gone cold and began reading. The headline alone made me uncomfortable. The women America never sees the quiet minds behind the nation's hardest decisions. There were 6 women featured in the story. I was the third. The opening paragraph wasn't about politics. It wasn't about power. It was about the thousands of public servants whose names never appeared in history books, even though their work quietly shaped history. That part I actually appreciated. Then I kept reading. The reporter had spent 14 months researching women in senior government positions. Not celebrities. Not politicians. People who worked behind closed doors. People who preferred staying invisible. I was one of them. I frowned. I had never spoken to this reporter. Never answered questions. Never posed for photographs. Then I realized every picture in the article had been taken at public events. International summits. Press briefings. Official White House photographs. Everything had been publicly available. The article simply connected pieces most people never bothered to notice. One former Secretary of State described me as the calmest person in any crisis. Another retired military commander said I'd prevented more than one international misunderstanding because I asked the questions everyone else overlooked. Reading compliments about yourself is uncomfortable under any circumstances. Reading them when your own parents have spent decades pretending you're a nobody, that feels almost surreal. Then I reached the paragraph that explained Rachel's phone call. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sensational. Just 2 simple sentences buried halfway through the article. Emily Carter financed both college and graduate school after her parents withdrew financial support. She rarely returns to her hometown because of a long-standing family estrangement. That was it. No accusations. No blame. No interviews with relatives. Just 2 verified facts. I leaned back in my chair. So that's what this is about. Dad wasn't angry because the article lied. He was angry because it didn't. My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Rachel. It was an old high school classmate I hadn't spoken to in almost 20 years. Emily, is that really you on the cover? Congratulations. Another message appeared. Then another. A cousin in Cincinnati. A former neighbor. Someone from my church youth group. Word was spreading across Ohio faster than I could process it. I closed my eyes. This wasn't what I wanted. I'd spent most of my adult life avoiding attention. Now it had arrived anyway. I needed answers. I found the reporter's contact information at the bottom of the article. It was nearly 11:30 at night. I expected voicemail. Instead, someone answered on the second ring. This is Daniel Brooks. Mr. Brooks, my name is Emily Carter. There was a brief pause. I was wondering if you might call. His voice was calm. Professional. I have one question, I said. Did we ever speak? No. Did anyone from my office arrange this interview? No. My family thinks I planned this. I can assure you, he said gently, you didn't. He explained how the investigation began. One of his editors wanted to profile senior women whose work shaped national policy without public recognition. The research lasted more than a year. They interviewed retired officials, former ambassadors, military leaders, policy experts. Everything had been verified through public records and multiple independent sources. No one from your family was contacted, he added. We actually couldn't find much information about your personal life. I laughed quietly. There isn't much to find. There was one thing we confirmed, he said. Your scholarship records. My scholarship. Your university archived them. I already knew where this conversation was headed. We confirmed your parents withdrew financial support after you accepted graduate school in Washington. I looked toward the window. I wasn't expecting that to be included. It helped explain your career, he said. You built it without family connections. I understand. Before hanging up, he said something that stayed with me. We almost removed those 2 sentences? Why didn't you? Because leaving them out would have made your story incomplete. After the call ended, I sat perfectly still. I wasn't angry at the article. If anything, I respected it. It told the truth. The problem was that truth had finally reached Dayton. And my father had spent 23 years making sure it never would. I opened an airline website. Washington to Dayton. The first nonstop flight left at 7 the next morning. My finger hovered over the purchase button. Maybe I should go. Maybe I could explain everything. Then memories started arriving one after another. Dad standing in the kitchen holding my Georgetown acceptance letter. You think you're better than this family. Mom refusing to answer my calls during my first Christmas in Washington. The graduation ceremony where I searched the audience one last time, knowing neither of them had come. I closed the laptop. Going home had never fixed anything. My phone buzzed again. Rachel? Not a call this time. A text. Actually, dozens of them. Screenshot after screenshot. Family group chats. Conversations between aunts, uncles, cousins. I scrolled slowly. My stomach tightened. Dad had been busy. She's exaggerating everything. Another message. She never worked at the White House. Then another. Magazines print whatever people pay them to print. I kept scrolling. Suddenly, I stopped. The next message made my hands shake. She probably slept with somebody important to get where she is. I stared at those words. They didn't even sound like my father. They sounded worse. Like a man so desperate to protect his pride that he'd rather destroy his own daughter's reputation than admit she'd succeeded. A new message appeared beneath the screenshots. It was from Rachel. Just 6 words. I know they've been lying. A few seconds later, another message. Please come home. I read both texts 3 times. For years, I'd convinced myself Rachel simply didn't notice how differently we were treated. Maybe that wasn't true. Maybe she'd believed the stories because she'd grown up hearing them. Just like everyone else. I looked around my apartment. The briefing folders still sat unopened on my kitchen table. Tomorrow morning, I was supposed to attend meetings that couldn't be postponed. My responsibilities were real. My country expected me back at work. But so was this. For the first time in my life, I wasn't going home because I wanted my parents to love me. I was going home because I needed to know how many lies they'd told while I was gone. I reopened the airline website. This time, I bought the ticket. The next morning, I walked into my office before sunrise. Washington looked exactly the way it always did at 6:30 in the morning. The sidewalks around the White House were already busy. Staffers hurried toward security checkpoints with coffee in one hand and government-issued badges in the other. Nothing about the city suggested my life had just turned upside down. I spent 30 minutes handing off my responsibilities to a trusted colleague. I've got a family emergency, I told him. He didn't ask questions. In our line of work, people respected privacy. By 8:15, I was driving toward Reagan National Airport. As the plane climbed above the Potomac River, I looked down at Washington, growing smaller beneath the clouds. I couldn't remember the last time I'd flown to Ohio because I wanted answers. Usually I went because someone was sick, or had died, or because guilt finally outweighed common sense. This time felt different. For once, I wasn't coming home to apologize for existing. I landed in Dayton just after 10. The airport looked exactly as I remembered. Smaller than Dulles, quieter, comfortable in a way that hadn't changed for decades. Instead of driving toward my parents' neighborhood, I rented a mid-sized sedan and checked into a Holiday Inn near Interstate 675. The young woman at the front desk smiled. Business or family? I laughed softly. I honestly don't know. She laughed too, assuming I was joking. I wished I had been. After leaving my suitcase in the room, I drove into town. Everything looked familiar. The bakery where Mom used to buy birthday cakes. The hardware store Dad visited almost every Saturday. The public library where I'd spent countless afternoons because it was quieter than home. Some places had changed. Most hadn't. Funny how a town can stand perfectly still while your entire life happens somewhere else. I parked outside the library without really planning to. The building smelled exactly the same. Old books. Wood polish. Coffee drifting in from the small cafe next door. An elderly librarian looked up from the circulation desk. She studied my face for a moment. Then her eyes widened. Emily Carter. I smiled. I guess I haven't changed that much. Oh, honey. She walked around the desk before I realized she intended to hug me. I saw that magazine. Congratulations. I thanked her, feeling strangely embarrassed. I've been meaning to ask, she said. Why did you disappear? I frowned. I didn't. She looked confused. We all thought you cut everyone off. I felt something tighten in my chest. I stayed in touch with whoever wanted to stay in touch. She blinked. That's not what people heard. Those 6 words stayed with me long after I left the library. That's not what people heard. Around lunchtime, I drove to my old high school. The football field looked smaller than I remembered. The brick buildings looked older. Retirement had finally caught up with Mr. Donnelly, my 10th grade history teacher, but he still volunteered in the alumni office twice a week. He recognized me immediately. Emily. He smiled so broadly I almost forgot why I was there. I've never been prouder of a former student. We spent nearly an hour talking. Not about Washington. About life, his grandchildren, his garden. Eventually, I asked the question that had been bothering me all morning. Can I ask you something? Of course. What did people think happened to me after I left? His smile faded. He leaned back in his chair. I always wondered if I should tell you. A chill ran through me. Tell me what... He hesitated. Your father used to say Washington changed you. Changed me how? He told people you became unstable. For a moment I couldn't speak. He said the pressure affected your mental health. He said you stopped speaking to the family because you weren't well. I stared at him. I've never... I know. He sighed. I never believed him. But Emily... Most people did. I left the school feeling numb. One lie. That could explain everything. Why cousins stopped calling. Why Christmas cards slowly disappeared. Why invitations stopped arriving. People hadn't abandoned me. They believed I'd abandoned them. I sat inside my rental car for almost 10 minutes before turning the key. Then I remembered something. The Dayton Gazette. Our local newspaper. If anyone knew the truth, it might be someone there. The newspaper office had moved into a smaller building years earlier. A receptionist greeted me warmly before disappearing into the back office. A few minutes later, an older man with silver hair walked toward me. You must be Emily. I'm Frank Miller. I retired 3 years ago. He offered his hand. I've been expecting you. I frowned. Expecting me? He nodded toward the latest issue of The Atlantic lying on his desk. I figured that article would eventually bring you home. We sat together in his office. Framed newspaper front pages covered the walls. Floods. Election nights. State championships. 40 years of local history. Frank folded his hands. There's something I've wanted to give you for a long time. He unlocked an old metal filing cabinet. After searching through several folders, he placed a thick manila envelope on the desk between us. My name was written across the front, in black ink. I looked up. What is this? He took a deep breath. Everything your father asked us not to publish. My heartbeat slowed. I don't understand. You will. Inside were newspaper drafts, photographs, scholarship announcements, academic awards, community recognition, every achievement I'd ever forgotten. None of them had been printed. Tucked behind the stack was a handwritten letter, then another, each signed by my father. The first one was dated 15 years earlier. Dear Mr. Miller, our daughter Emily is experiencing serious emotional difficulties. We respectfully ask that you not publish anything regarding her scholarship or career. Public attention would only make her condition worse. Thank you for respecting our family's privacy. Sincerely, Thomas Carter. My hands started shaking. I looked at Frank. Did you believe this? At first, he answered honestly. Then I noticed a pattern. What pattern? Every time you accomplished something. Another letter arrived. I slowly turned the pages. There were 15 letters. Different years. Different excuses. Always the same request. Please don't publish Emily's name. Frank looked at me quietly. Eventually, I realized it wasn't about protecting you. It was about hiding you. Tears blurred the words in front of me. For 23 years, I'd wondered why nobody back home ever seemed to know what I was doing. Now I knew. Someone had been erasing me, one letter at a time. Frank reached into another folder. There's one more thing. He slid a sealed envelope across the desk. I kept this because someday, I thought you deserved to have it. I opened it carefully. Inside was the original handwritten letter, not a copy. The original, complete with my father's signature. The ink had faded slightly over the years, but not enough to hide the truth. I stared at it for a long time. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't family conflict. It wasn't different personalities. It was a deliberate campaign. For over 2 decades, my own father had worked harder to erase my life than I had worked to build it. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. For the first time since boarding the plane that morning, I wasn't wondering whether I should confront my parents. I was wondering how many other lies were still waiting for me. I barely slept that night. The envelope from Frank Miller sat on the small desk in my hotel room. I must have opened it 10 times. Each time I hoped I'd misunderstood. Each time my father's handwriting stared back at me. By morning, I'd made my decision. I wasn't going to my parents' house. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to demand an apology. If I showed up anywhere, it would only be because Rachel asked me to. Around noon, my phone buzzed. Rachel, can we meet alone? We met at a small coffee shop a few miles from downtown. She looked exhausted. Her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles beneath her eyes. When she saw me, she stood awkwardly before pulling me into a hug. For a second, I forgot we hadn't hugged in years. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked, why did you call me a liar? She looked down at her coffee. Because I believed them, she swallowed hard. They've been telling me the same stories my whole life. She laughed bitterly. I honestly thought you didn't care about us. I reached into my purse and laid one of Dad's letters on the table. She picked it up. Halfway through reading it, her face turned white. No. She grabbed another, then another. By the third letter, tears were running down her cheeks. He told everyone you were mentally unstable. I nodded. For years. She covered her mouth. I never knew. I believe you. She looked at me through tears. I invited you today because... She hesitated. Because I want you at the engagement party. I don't know if that's a good idea. No. Her voice was steady now. I think it's exactly what needs to happen. The Oakwood Country Club had hosted weddings, charity auctions, and retirement dinners for decades. My parents loved the place. To them, it represented success, status, respectability. I parked across the street and sat in my rental car for several minutes. Guests in suits and dresses walked toward the entrance, carrying wrapped gifts. Laughter drifted through the open doors. For a moment, I considered driving away. I wasn't afraid of my father. I was afraid of becoming the angry daughter he'd spent 23 years describing. I didn't want revenge to change who I was. My phone buzzed. Rachel, please come inside. I took one deep breath, then another. Finally, I stepped out of the car. I wore a simple navy dress, low heels, a pearl necklace my grandmother had left me years earlier. Nothing expensive. Nothing flashy. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. Inside, a jazz trio played softly near the ballroom windows. Servers carried trays of champagne. The room held nearly 200 people. Neighbors, business owners, church friends, old classmates. For several seconds, nobody noticed me. Then someone near the entrance looked up. I think that's... His voice trailed off. Another guest turned. Then another. Conversation slowed. Within seconds, the room had become strangely quiet. My father noticed the silence before he noticed me. When he turned around, his smile disappeared. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Rachel crossed the room first. She walked directly to me and took my hand. I'm glad you came. My father forced a smile. I didn't know we had another guest. Rachel answered before I could. I invited her. His jaw tightened. He looked around the room. Too many people were watching. He couldn't make a scene. Not yet. The evening continued awkwardly. People approached me quietly. Several recognized me from the magazine. One retired Army colonel thanked me for my years of public service. An elderly couple asked whether Washington really looked as beautiful during spring as it did on television. The conversations were ordinary, kind, respectful. Exactly the opposite of what my father feared. Then came the toast. My father stood behind the microphone with a champagne glass in his hand. He smiled confidently. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us to celebrate Rachel and Daniel. Applause filled the room. He continued. Our family has always believed in honesty. He glanced toward me. And not everyone these days can say the same. A few uncomfortable laughs echoed through the ballroom. He wasn't finished. Some people would rather become famous in magazines than spend time with family. Silence. He expected people to laugh again. Nobody did. Instead, everyone looked at me. I stood slowly. Not because I wanted attention. Because I knew if I stayed seated, my father would keep lying. I walked toward the front of the room. Each step sounded louder than the last. When I reached him, I didn't reach for the microphone. Instead, I placed Frank's envelope on the table beside him. What is this? He asked. You know? I don't. Open it. His confidence faded. He looked at the envelope, then at me. I don't have time for games. This isn't a game. Rachel quietly stepped beside us. Dad, please. He opened the envelope. The first letter appeared. His handwriting. His signature. The color drained from his face. He flipped to another, then another. His hands began trembling. Someone near the front asked softly, What are those? I finally picked up the microphone. They're letters. I kept my voice calm. Letters my father sent to local newspapers over the past 23 years. No one spoke. He asked editors not to publish my scholarships, my promotions, my awards, my name. I looked around the room. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm asking you to read what he wrote. I handed the first letter to one of my father's longtime business partners. He read silently, then passed it to his wife. Within minutes, the letters moved from table to table. Nobody argued. Nobody whispered. People simply read. The ballroom grew quieter than I'd ever heard it. Rachel wiped tears from her face as she read each page. She looked at our father. You told me Emily abandoned us. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She held up one letter. You told the newspaper she was mentally unstable. You knew she wasn't. No answer. I stepped back to the microphone one last time. I spent years wondering why everyone in Dayton forgot about me. I blamed myself. I thought maybe I hadn't called enough. Maybe I hadn't visited enough. I looked at my father. But the truth was much simpler. You worked harder to erase me than I ever worked to make you proud. The room remained completely silent. I didn't come here to embarrass anyone. I came because the truth deserves a place at this table. I laid the microphone down. Then I walked toward the exit. No dramatic speech. No shouting. No insults. Just truth. As I reached the ballroom doors, I heard chairs moving behind me, one after another. People quietly began leaving. Not because I asked them to, because they no longer knew what to say to a man who had spent 2 decades trying to erase his own daughter. Outside, the cool Ohio evening wrapped around me. I took the deepest breath I'd taken in years. For the first time since leaving Dayton at 24, I wasn't carrying my father's version of my life anymore. Only my own. When I returned to Washington that Monday morning, nothing had changed. The security gate still opened at exactly the same speed. The Marine standing outside the West Wing still nodded as I walked past. My assistant had already stacked 3 briefing folders on my desk before I arrived. A meeting about Eastern Europe started at 8. Another about cybersecurity followed at 10. By lunchtime, it almost felt as if the weekend in Ohio had happened to someone else. Government has a way of doing that. History keeps moving whether your heart is broken or not. Still, something inside me had changed. For years, I'd carried an invisible weight. Every promotion, every award, every difficult decision I'd made in Washington had been followed by the same quiet thought. Maybe now they'll finally be proud. I hadn't realized how much of my life had been spent chasing approval that was never coming. Now I finally knew why. It wasn't because I wasn't enough. It was because my father had already decided who I was before I ever left Ohio. No promotion could change a story someone refuses to stop telling. And strangely, accepting that brought me peace. 2 weeks after the engagement party, Rachel called. This time her voice sounded different. Calmer, older somehow. Are you home? I just got back. I'm outside. I looked out the apartment window. There she was, standing beside a taxi with 2 suitcases. I hurried downstairs. She smiled nervously. I hope you don't mind. I took a leave from work. I needed to get away for a while. I hugged her before she could say anything else. Come upstairs. That first evening, we ordered pizza from the little place around the corner. We ate sitting on my living room floor because I only owned a small dining table. Rachel looked around the apartment. So this is your exciting Washington life? I laughed. Not exactly glamorous, is it? She smiled. I always imagined you lived in some fancy government house. I wish. She looked at the bookshelf against the wall. Books on history, foreign policy, leadership, a few old novels, one framed photograph of us as little girls sitting on the swings in our grandparents' backyard. Rachel picked it up. I forgot this picture existed. I didn't. She stared at it quietly. I'm sorry, Emily. I know. No. She shook her head. I don't think you do. I need you to understand something. I wasn't your enemy. I was just raised inside the same lie. I reached across the coffee table and squeezed her hand. I know. For the first time in decades, it finally felt true. Over the next several months, Rachel rented an apartment in Northern Virginia. We started having dinner together every Thursday. Nothing fancy. Sometimes tacos. Sometimes Chinese takeout. Sometimes grilled cheese sandwiches when neither of us felt like cooking. We weren't trying to make up for 23 years. We were simply learning how to be sisters without anyone standing between us. About a month after Rachel moved, I received the first email from my father. The subject line simply read, "Please read." I almost deleted it. Instead, I opened it. It wasn't an apology. It was an explanation. He blamed the newspaper. He blamed Washington. He blamed misunderstandings. He blamed pride. Mostly, he blamed everyone except himself. I didn't respond. Over the next 6 weeks, more emails arrived. Some were angry, others defensive. Then gradually, the tone changed. One afternoon, a message appeared that contained only 4 words. I was wrong. Nothing else. No excuses, no explanations. Just those 4 words. I stared at the screen for a long time. Finally, I wrote back. Not because he deserved an answer, because I deserved peace. My reply was short. Dad, I forgive you. Not because the past didn't happen. Not because you've repaired what was broken. I forgive you because I no longer want to carry the anger. But forgiveness isn't reconciliation. Reconciliation requires truth, trust, and time. Those things can't be rushed. I genuinely hope you find peace. Emily. I never received a reply. 3 months later, my phone rang while I was leaving work. It was my mother. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead, I answered. Hello. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'm at Union Station. I stopped walking. What? I took the train. I was hoping... She hesitated. If you have time. 20 minutes later, I found her sitting alone on a wooden bench inside the station. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older, too. Her hair had turned almost completely gray. When she stood, neither of us knew whether to hug. We settled for awkward smiles. I've never been to Washington, she said quietly. I know. I thought... She looked around. Maybe you could show me where you've spent all these years. So I did. We walked slowly. Past the government buildings where I'd worked. Past Lafayette Square. Past the White House fence where tourists took photographs without realizing how many ordinary people worked quietly inside. I pointed toward the West Wing. That's where my office is. She stared for several seconds. I had no idea. I know. There wasn't any anger in my voice anymore. Only acceptance. Later that afternoon, we bought coffee from a food truck near the National Mall. We sat on a bench facing the Lincoln Memorial. People walked by with cameras. Children chased pigeons across the grass. A light breeze moved through the trees. My mother wrapped both hands around her paper coffee cup. I missed your whole life. I looked toward the reflecting pool. You missed part of it. There are still chapters left. She nodded slowly. A single tear rolled down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. Neither did I. Some silences don't need to be filled. As the sun began to set behind the memorial, I realized something that would have been impossible for me to say a year earlier. Success hadn't healed my childhood. Recognition hadn't healed it either. Justice hadn't erased it. But truth had finally given those old wounds a name. And once something has a name, it stops controlling your life. Looking back now, people sometimes ask if exposing my father was worth it. They're asking the wrong question. I never wanted to expose him. I wanted to stop hiding. There's a difference. The truth wasn't my revenge. The truth was my freedom. If this story reminds you of someone who spent years feeling invisible, I hope you'll let them know they're seen. And if you've ever had to choose between protecting someone else's comfort and protecting your own dignity, I hope you choose dignity. Thank you for spending this time with me.